Started.
Thank you, Tracy. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Linda Hashef. I'm the Executive Director of Opportunity Alliance Nevada, and we are very glad that you can join us today for our next panel discussion in our series, Pathways to Racial Economic Justice. We have another wonderful panel joining us today to discuss the justice system, and we appreciate you being here as well. First, I want to extend a big thank you to our sponsors who in some part make this series possible. That's Charles Schwab Bank, US Bank, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, the Estepona Group, and Vegas PBS. And a few housekeeping items before we get started. All participants will be placed on mute. But there is a chat function at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to post it in the chat box, and Tracy and I will keep an eye on it. So as we've mentioned before in these series, the purpose of this forum is to provide an avenue to examine and understand the impacts of the past, discuss and explore opportunities for change and improvement going forward. And before we get started, I'd like to share some information about Opportunity Alliance, who we are and why we do what we do. We are a statewide organization that brings together resources and people from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds to investigate and understand barriers faced by struggling low to moderate income Nevadans, and to build and provide pathways to self-sufficiency. We accomplish this through training, financial coaching, mentorship, education, and advocacy partners and collaborations. We collaborate and partner with public and private nonprofit organizations in an effort to build the financial wellness of their employees and the clients they serve. We offer training such as Bridges Out of Poverty, financial coaching, and Getting Ahead in a Just Getting By world. We investigate, educate, and advocate for policies that provide pathways for all Nevadans to build wealth and economic security. So that really leads us to today, the fifth panel in our series. We have discussed wealth disparities, housing gaps, the health wealth approaches for an inclusive economy, and workforce development and small business entrepreneurship. Those were our previous panels, and today we will be discussing the justice system. We do not view ourselves as experts on the topics of racial economic disparities, and that is why we have invited national, state, and local experts to lead this very important conversation. We are really happy to be able to convene this forum and bring the experts today to speak with you. With the recent national events related to racial injustice, we wanted to provide this forum to discuss pathways to racial economic justice. We want you to know that we stand in solidarity with the fight against systemic racial economic disparities and the historic financial oppression of people of color. We are so inspired by so many in our community who are using their voices to make change. We see you and we are with you. So let's talk about it. This is intended to be an open and direct forum for everyone. The focus will remain on financial and economic factors, and we look forward to a respectful and thoughtful conversation. So now I would like to introduce you to Kip Ortenberger, who is the host and moderator of the Nevada Week show on Vegas PBS. And he has generously agreed to be the moderator of this series for us. So we're in very good hands. So welcome, Kip.
Linda, thank you. Really appreciate it. As always, thank you to Opportunity Alliance in Nevada for putting on this series. We've had some really, really great conversations, and I know this one is going to be absolutely no different. As I did during last week's conversation around labor force, workforce, and small business, I just kind of want to recap what the major themes of what we have been talking about has become, and I think how it then aligns and relates and connects to the criminal justice as well. Wealth, as Linda mentioned, is the key of what we are talking about here. We have talked about how lack of wealth can exacerbate issues in health, in wealth, in housing, in labor, and in small business. We've also talked about how these areas can also can also form barriers to wealth. Criminal justice is no different, as I've learned just by briefly speaking to our panel. But we're going to go into a lot more detail in exactly those two things of how it can exacerbate lack of wealth and how it can also form barriers to wealth. Our experts, let me introduce them: Wendell, Carl, Blaylock. Recognized as a company and community leader, Wendell Blaylock has advocated successfully for the development of organization programs, policies, and practices that have resulted in significantly increasing diversity and inclusion in the areas of onboarding, mentoring, and promotion within a major multinational banking and financial services holding company. Wendell is a United States Air Force veteran, a captain. He earned his Bachelor's of Science degree from Baylor University and his Master's of Science degree from the University of Texas at Arlington. He completed executive certification programs in strategic diversity and inclusion management, sponsored by Georgetown University and the Society for Human Resource Management. In addition, he is certified in employee relation law from the Institute of Applied Management and Law and served as an adjunct facility member with the Georgetown College of Continuing and Professional Education. Wendell was appointed in 2012 as an advisor to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, assisting with fact-finding, investigations, policy guidance, and the dissemination of information pertinent to local and state civil rights issues. He currently serves as the chair of the Nevada Advisory Committee to the Commission. Wendell's community involvement and recognition are extensive. He is on the advisory board for Teach for America, Las Vegas, and serves with a number of community and veteran organizations, including the Thunderbird chapter of the Air Force Association, National Association for Black Veterans, Merging Veterans and Players, and a representative to the Congressional Black Caucus in 2010, and the Caucus Military Veterans Event in 2017. As a result of his outstanding professional and community achievements in Nevada, he is recognized as a citizen of distinction for Las Vegas, Who's Who in Black Las Vegas, and named one of the distinguished men for the state of Nevada. Recently, he was appointed by Governor Sisolak as a commissioner to the Veterans Services Commission. Let's welcome Wendell. Wendell, thank you for being here. We also have David Figler. David Figler is a private attorney and has practiced in Las Vegas since 1991. A former special public defender and Las Vegas Municipal Court judge, his practice currently emphasizes complex criminal litigation, appellate preservation strategies, gaming law with a focus on import of problem gambling, and administrative law. Figler is involved in his community both as a volunteer for nonprofit causes, a frequent speaker in local schools, and as a lauded writer and arts organizer. The Nevada Arts Council has twice awarded Figler with competitive fellowships for excellence in the arts. He has also received awards for Best Radio Program, Local Influencer of the Year, and Favorite Radio Personality for his personal essays aired on local and national public radio. He writes an award-winning column on legal and social issues for the Nevada Independent. He currently sits on the Legal Aid of Southern Nevada's Pro Bono Advisory Council and was awarded the prestigious Medal of Honor from the Nevada State Bar in 2019. Let's welcome David. David, Wendell, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Let's get right into the conversation first. And I want to frame this first by, as we talked about when we were criminal justice is a wide and diverse swath of discussion points. I want to maybe set the stage on exactly specifically what we're talking about here. Of course, police brutality, law enforcement violence are in the news. We're going to not focus on that as much, but we're going to focus more on the court side of this, from arrest to incarceration. But I wanted you both to maybe just give a quick overview of specifically, if you can, contextually, what it is we're going to talk about. And Wendell, let's start with you.
I want to emphasize that I'm not a spokesperson for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. However, I am able to share information that we have researched and done here in the state of Nevada. And I would encourage all of our listeners to go to the Civil Rights website, which is usccr.gov. There you will see a link for the state advisory committees, and you'll be able to see all of the reports that we have done here in the state of Nevada. Now, one of our reports is on municipal fines and fees. And this came out of, in 2014, the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The Department of Justice was called in to do research because Michael was an unarmed teen that was shot because he and a friend were walking in the street. A police officer stopped by and told them that they needed to move to the sidewalk. That escalated and it resulted in him being shot. So the Department of Justice was called in to do some research. And what the Department of Justice found is that the Ferguson law enforcement efforts were focused on generating revenue by enforcing municipal fines and fees at the expense of public safety. So let me repeat that. Law enforcement focused on generating revenue by enforcing municipal fines and fees at the expense of ensuring public safety needs. They also found that the practice of raising revenue through the court system challenged the independent role of the judiciary. It shifted the essential functions of the courts and, let me emphasize this, adversely impacted the most vulnerable communities, especially those living in or near poverty. So we examined that here in the state of Nevada to see where we were in comparison to what was happening in other states. And it was quite interesting. What we found is that there was a severe deficit of demographic data and tracking. So what that meant is that the Nevada courts and law enforcement were not required to collect demographic information regarding who utilized the court system and who interacts with law enforcement. There was no data about who had paid off fees and fines, who was on a payment plan, people that were given an alternative to perform community service, those that had a hearing and what type. And law enforcement did not maintain demographic information for individuals. So they didn't have information on a bench warrant as a result of inability to pay, who was being held in jail as a result of inability to pay, and how long they had been there. They also didn't know who was being stopped and for what violations.
So Wendell, can I stop you really quick? We'll get
Yes,
into the data. We'll get into the data piece of this in just a sec. Fines and fees you mentioned, very, very important. We're going to talk about the court system as well. I want to bring David into the conversation. In addition to that, David, particularly, what do we want to focus our discussion on today when we're really discussing the spectrum here of criminal justice?
Thanks, Kip. And I really appreciate Wendell's background and perspective, especially as Wendell is very adept at discussing both the data gathered and the data ungathered, and how important that is for this discussion. Where I'm coming from is going to be largely anecdotal, primarily because I have a large number of anecdotes, having served on the ground for very many years, both in the public defense system, in the private public defense system hybrid, as a municipal court judge, and now as a private attorney and a commentator, and on the various boards and committees that I have served on, both with the Nevada Supreme Court down. And so what we're really looking at overall today, I think, is going to be an evaluation of the system, right? That includes looking at the flaws of the systems, the concerns of the systems, and various adjustments to the systems that can be accomplished and that are of particular import to communities of color and communities of economic distress. However, I would be remiss if I didn't make my one sort of pitch in 30 years of practice and observation and participation that the system that we're talking about is quite broken. Indeed, I believe, from my perspective and some of the things that we're going to talk about today, that the system is broken so much that it is beyond fixing, although it certainly does need to be addressed and discussed because it is our current system. But I think as we outline some of the inequities that are in the system, some of the adjustments and perhaps my perspective that the system is broken beyond repair may resonate with some of the people listening. That said, our system involves a lot of different parts to it. And as you indicated, Kip, we're going to really focus on once individuals are entering the system through arrest. The systems that we talk about involve law enforcement. And while we're not going to be talking about police brutality, but we might be talking about some of the data points, let's be clear that while very small percentage of police officers operate outside this system, and there has been a lot of focus on those who do operate outside in the system, the systemic issues with the system is that the system is designed for these inequities. And so people are doing their job, they're doing it the way that they're taught, they're doing the way they're instructed. It's not particularly or overtly a racist system, but the implicit biases and the systemic racism never relies upon explicit racism. It relies on people doing their day-to-day activities, not fully comprehending or understanding that that is part of a systemically racist system. And that's, I think, what some of the anecdotes and the data that Wendell's going to share is really going to talk about. We're going to talk about how people come into the system and how in looking for bad actors, we sometimes see workarounds of the United States and the Nevada state constitution. We see a lot of people living in the gray areas that the court systems have tacitly endorsed or pushing the envelope of some of those systems. And then we're looking at a primarily punitive court system that oftentimes results in unfortunately, vengeance-based punishments. And when I say the word vengeance, I think we're going to talk about arbitrary and unscientific incarceration periods with virtually no mindfulness of the secondary impact of incarcerating people or the impact on their families, and really the zero net gain of incarceration as it comes to solving some of the issues and problems of this broken system that we're going to be talking about. So I intend to explain a lot of the processes that I deal with day to day and many of the practical imports of the policies that we've adopted, that we've accepted, but more importantly, that we can strive to achieve.
Yeah, and David, let's start with the secondary impact you mentioned there, and let's bring it back to the wealth gap here. And Wendell, when we're talking about secondary impact, and let's not just focus on incarceration itself, let's focus on arrest. Let's focus on the court system as well. You know, how are these things widening this wealth gap?
Well, I would concur with David that the system here in Nevada is in need of repair. Number one, we don't have any data. So we don't have sufficient data so that we can determine if there is a disparate impact, although there is information that shows that there is an impact, that there is an impact to our citizens that are overwhelmingly poor, and in addition, that impact African Americans and Hispanics. But we're not able to go to the court records, we're not able to go to law enforcement for that information or the data between the two because they're just not tracking it. So as a result, they just keep doing the same thing over and over.
Do we have any overarching data, David and Wendell, both? I mean, the most obvious ones, of course, are employment, potential barriers to employment. If you've been incarcerated, if you potentially have a record, in some cases, maybe even if you've had an arrest, or certain fines or fees levied. Home ownership has come up. I was reading something recently that Pew Research did about huge home ownership and rental gaps because from individuals that have been incarcerated. Even public support, federal support, state support sometimes can be contingent upon if you have a record. Do we have data that shows a direct impact of being within the system and really widening some of the gaps in some of these more broad areas?
Well, I'll take a little stab at that because that's a really big question that you asked, Kip. So let's focus on who interacts with law enforcement more, because we do have a lot of data on that. And I would very comfortably say that if you have been incarcerated or in the system, which has really turned your life upside down. I mean, I appreciate that there are a whole spectrum of offenses that can land somebody in the scope of law enforcement for the essentially, enforcing the laws that are written, everything from, obviously the most violent crimes all the way down to the most minor of traffic offenses. And what we do know is that individuals of color and in poverty systems are more vulnerable to interaction, let alone negative interaction with law enforcement, and that exponentially increases if you've been through a period of incarceration, right? So with regard to that aspect of your question, if you've been sort of taken off the grid and your family has lost you and potentially you were a bread earner or a contributor to the family unit, and even the stability of the family unit, losing a member of that family to incarceration for what could very well be an extended period of time or even a very short period of time where you've lost your job. Let's take a very narrow example very quickly before I go off in too many directions. But, if somebody doesn't have the money to re-register their car timely, and they live in a economically depressed neighborhood, they're much more likely to have a negative interaction with law enforcement over that lapse registration. If somebody forgot or didn't have the money right away to pay a very small fine that has now grown with fees and bench warrant fees, et cetera, the risk of incarceration is higher. And now think about that. Even if it was incarceration for a day or two or three, how many people who were very dependent on a tenuous job have now lost that job, which now has a domino effect of the ability to pay rent or mortgage, the ability to feed one's family. I mean, so it is exponential in that regard. But even more so if you have been incarcerated for years and taken out of the system. And that's before we even get to the negative impact and the psychological impact of being in our horrific incarceration systems within the state of Nevada that have not really been looked at, audited, or updated in decades. And so, I think it's fairly obvious of the secondary and tertiary impact on the individuals and their families once they're in the sights of the criminal justice system or law enforcement, and that their visibility to law enforcement and the type of negative interactions that we're probably going to be talking about are an outgrowth of what neighborhood they live in and their economic status and their ability to do the things that many of us in this conversation probably take for granted: paying bills on time, not being in the sights of law enforcement, not having to deal with extended or implicitly biased interactions. And so when Wendell talks about the data, which is vital and missing and important for us to be able to problem solve, we're looking at, like the race of the individuals who are being pulled over, what neighborhoods or zip codes they're being pulled over in, what type of charges they're being investigated for or stopped. But even more importantly, the length of the transaction compared to other transactions. So if you or I were to be pulled over in a neighborhood with a higher median economic or income value, our interaction with the police, if we committed an offense like going through a stop sign or having a lapse registration, may be very nominal or minimal. Whereas in a different zip code or a person of a different color, their interaction may be extended by a very long time. It may also include things like, and this is anecdotally and anecdotally not in one or two instances, but dozens of instances, where anecdotally someone is stopped for a broken tail light or failure to signal within 10 feet of what the law requires, and they're out there for 2 hours with their entire cars being searched, looking for reasons to arrest that person or detain that person. And even if they do find it, it should be offensive not just to people who believe in the rule of law and Constitution, but also that these communities are being unfairly targeted and unfairly exposed to the negative negative impacts of the criminal justice system that others aren't. And that's the comparison. So these are all the data points I think that Wendell is going to talk about and knows quite a bit more than I do about. But from our perspective of when I talk to my clients and hear their experiences, especially clients of color and clients of lower economic strata, we see very, very different interactions and experiences and secondary impacts than we do with other portions of our society.
And if I can piggyback on that, what we did find is in 2015, the Las Vegas Review-Journal investigated law enforcement data and found that residents living in the 7 poorest statistically African-American and Hispanic zip codes accounted for 2/3 of traffic citations. And that was in 2015. And in 2002, there was a study commissioned by the Nevada legislature, and it found that African-American and Hispanic residents in Nevada were more likely to be pulled over for traffic stops than white residents. African-American residents were more likely to be searched statewide and across all participating law enforcement agencies. African-American drivers were searched at a high rate, which was more than twice of white drivers. So that's consistent with what David was sharing.
Yeah, and I mean, to the layperson, very surprising that we have such disproportions in stops and citations. And I ask you both, and this comes into something I think we'll be talking and weaving throughout, is the implicit versus explicit bias here. And David, you said there's not a lot of explicit bias and racism. It is more implicit. But when you see those types of disproportions, it's hard not to think that there is more explicit decision-making going on that is leading to that, or is there not?
I mean, I think it's just a system that we've relied upon because a large swath of our community, and unfortunately endemic within our legislative bodies, feel that this is a system that keeps us safe, that this is a system that keeps us protected, and that the players are beyond reproach. So what we're seeing differently with the very recent protests in the streets are calls for accountability, which is really just a very small portion of this. Certainly, all the bad actors need to be held accountable, and they're not beyond reproach simply because they do a very important and sometimes dangerous service of keeping the community safe. But the community safety at the expense of these type of not just inadequate, but absolutely destructive systems within our communities finally needs to have its day of sunshine. You know, the legislature, even in this last special session, did call for more data. That's important. The question is, do they have the ability to analyze the data correctly? Are they calling for all the data? And are the sources of the data going to be forthright with the data that's there, which exposes these sort of implicit biases? Do I think that a significant portion of our law enforcement or our prosecutors are racist people, are people who come from a place of prejudice? No, absolutely not. Do I think that we have defaulted to a system that we all think is the best system in the world that doesn't need to be reinvented? And so these sort of insidious underpinnings of the system are allowed to remain? Absolutely. It is the fear. It is the fear in the, I believe, in electeds of making changes that are going to be criticized as being, which I think is a non sequitur, soft on crime. There's no such thing in my mind as soft on crime. What you're talking about is being hard on people. And that's the actual balance, not the balance between community safety and fairness. So the conversation has been often misdirected. We have good data that talks about the biases, the impact. And when people talk about systemic racism, it means that the system is racist, not necessarily the people doing the functions within it. But the implicit bias conversation is important because it needs to be remedied and rectified, but it is just one thread of many threads of a system that needs reevaluating.
And
Wendell, I wanted to ask you too, since we've been talking about data, let's dive deeper into this. We've
Yes.
talked about some of the data points that we do have. Let's talk about the data points we do not have that are critical to this discussion.
So that's a really good question. And one of our recommendations when we did this report was that we do have consistent and complete reporting of demographic information by state and local courts and law enforcement. And the data should include, but not be limited to, race, color, veteran status, and the data should reference zip code where the violation occurred and what type of violation. And all of this information should be readily available to the public. And I wonder, one of the individuals who provided testimony during our hearing in 2017 is on this call, and she's raised her hand. I wonder, Lisa, if there's something that you would like to add.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say hello to everyone and thank you for having this call. This is such an important discussion, and it's one that I have personally been involved with as an activist for several years, and I was recently named as the state director for the Fines and Fees Justice Center. So I get to have this conversation with more folks on a broader level. And I did present at that Civil Rights Commission meeting in 2017. But I think everything that's been said on this conversation, during this conversation, is absolutely correct. From the folks who it affects the most, we know that that's Black and Brown communities. We know that it affects the poor. So we shouldn't just look at this through a racial lens, but also through a lens of poverty. We also know that the fallout from this, from people losing their jobs, people losing their homes, people losing their children in some cases, all of these are directly related to this issue of having outstanding fines and fees. And it is an economic issue. And since I have come on as the state director, what we have been trying to do is, like you, collect this data and put together a plan to take back to the legislature to say, this is what we're asking for. We're asking for the cessation of debt-based driver license suspensions, because that presents a whole nother issue. But courts are suspending people's driver's license for failure to pay and also failure to appear on traffic warrants that are related to infractions as small as having an expired registration. And so if you can't drive to work, you can't feed your family. I am also presenting this as a public health issue, because the stress that families are feeling because they look in their rearview mirror and see an officer behind them and people going to court, the stress that sometimes causes, the stress of not being able to feed your families, the fallout from that, the emotional toll that takes on families, that is a public health issue. So I'm also presenting it from that perspective. I'd be happy to meet with anyone offline or answer any questions that I may have brought up or that may have come up since I've been speaking. But I want to just sit back and listen to you, Wendell and David, the experts, and continue to listen. And if you have any more questions for me, I'd be happy to ask them. I am just thrilled that this conversation is being heard more. So thank you for your opportunity.
Well, thank you. And if I could piggyback on one thing you said, what actually is the purpose of fines and fees? So there was a question about, is it practical because people don't have the money to pay? Is it rehabilitative? And how is it rehabilitative? And then there is, as you have shared with us, the disparate impact on youth of color in the justice system. So there are a lot of questions about exactly what is the purpose of all of these fines and fees within the criminal justice system. What purpose does that serve?
Well, I think there's a theory about what purpose it serves, taking responsibility. But the fact is that we know the purpose of this is purely financial. As I am digging through legislation and following the money, so to speak, and looking where all of this money goes, there are so many hands. There are so many folks, I'll just use that, and that have their hands in this pot. We know that the courts say this money goes to pay for their specialty courts. We know that. And that's a good thing. But you're paying for these courts, these programs on the backs of poor people. And we're not saying that those programs aren't necessary, but we're also looking at where these fines and fees go to fund things like research. We're talking about maybe stem cell research. As you all may remember, a few years ago, laws were passed that allows DNA to be collected for anyone that's arrested for a felony. Well, guess what? There are fees that are associated with your traffic violations that go to pay for that. So there are so many different fees involved. And when we're talking about the administrative assessments, those administrative assessments go even further. There are some that go to fund state programs. There are some that go to fund salaries in some cases. And one of the things that we are learning as we begin to research this more and look at where this money goes, I mean, from municipal court to justice court, everybody gets to do something different with it. There are state mandated fees that are associated with traffic violations, but then the courts have inherent authority, what we're learning from a case called Blackjack, that gives them inherent authority to assess fees based on their own discretion. They have the right to do that. So there are just it's about money. It is about money. Like I said, in theory, we would think that this would be a way to hold people responsible for an infraction, but at the end of the day, what it boils down to is this is about money.
And if I could step in really quick, because since we're talking about money, I want to bring in the public defense piece of this conversation too, David, and you are a public defender. You give us some perspective there, and especially as we're talking about fines and fees, how well funded is public defense?
Sure. So there's a couple of things to unload there, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't expound a little bit on what Lisa said, but I'm going to kind of tie it back into your specific question about public defense. It is absolutely a revenue stream, and it is absolutely a decision on one part. The decision is that since alleged infractors or violators are essentially, and I use this pejoratively on purpose because this is the lens of the system, that bad people have no say. If we're going to use them as the revenue stream, they don't have power. They traditionally don't have power in these communities that have suffered from racist policies for generations, that have created generational poverty. And so they're a scapegoat and a revenue stream. And the system is used to extract as much revenue from those individuals as possible. So fines and fees, yes, but also the system of warrants and warrant fees and collection fees. And all these fees are, as Lisa indicated, placed upon the backs of poor folk, because those with power, those who could be an alternate revenue stream, refuse to accept any increase in property taxes. We don't have state or individual taxes in Nevada. And so those revenue streams need to come from somewhere to support whatever good or bad programming that exists. And so the decision is made to put it on those who not only have been traditionally oppressed, but those who have the smallest and the least effective voice in objecting to it. And some of these come from state legislative enactments, some are from municipalities, but they all pile on because there's very few barriers or even discussion about the impact of utilizing these folks as the revenue stream. Secondarily, I think it's racist. And I think that it can be traced back to the idea that we want to keep certain communities disempowered. And this is a way to do it. It might be not at the front of the conscience, but it is certainly traceable back all the way to slavery, and through the various manifestations through the 14th Amendment and prison labor and every other aspect of it. It's wrong. It's wrong thinking, and it doesn't really benefit anyone. So now let's talk about the public defense system. The public defense system in Nevada is fairly well funded. I would say compared to other communities, we do pretty well. The participants in it are actually well compensated. I think we're in the upper strata of public defense compensation, and that some of the best and the brightest of young lawyers and practicing lawyers are in the public defense system. So those are all the positives I want to talk about the public defense system. However, There are some implicit biases against public defenders as well, and I think that is a result of the views towards the individuals who need and require public defense systems. And so if a private attorney, someone can afford to come into a court, who might have a different relationship with the judge as a contributor or as a former colleague or as someone who is in the same social systems or strata, et cetera, comes into court and advocates for their client, it is invariably heard because of implicit bias in a different way than if a public defender is to make the exact same arguments. We see this when we talk about reduction of fines or fees or culpability. We talk about this in forgiveness of some of the outrageous fees that are associated. We talk about this in the conversation about bail and the conversation of cash bail. So there is a great distinction, and I think the way that the public defenders are perceived in the courts, and as a result, the ability for them to effectively advocate for their clients, that's one part of it. And I think that's a really important systemic part of it. Now, resource-wise, I will make this comment. The prosecutor system and the public defense system are supposed to have a certain degree in our society, in our state specifically, of parity. That if the DA has X number of attorneys, then the public defender should have an equal number for caseloads, et cetera. Where it changes is that the relationship between law enforcement and the prosecutors throughout the state is a very strong one. So when we talk about investigating incidences or doing our due diligence on behalf of our clients, whether it be for minor matters or large, whether it be on issues of fines and fees and bail, or actually investigation into the quantum of proof necessary to prove someone guilty to put them into the incarceration systems or probation, which we're also going to hopefully be able to talk about. The prosecutors have the entirety of law enforcement as a resource for investigation. Most investigations happen prior. Well, now, if you're wealthy, you tend to be able to inoculate yourself or have your attorneys even before you're arrested. To intervene on your behalf. The public defense system does not get afforded that same level of protection. And certainly, even appointed public defender investigators are no match for the depth and resource of law enforcement, which is also essentially at the beck and call of the prosecuting agencies. And so there are these enormous economic differences between an individual who has a public defender and someone who has a private attorney. And not because one is better than the other, but it is an issue of resource and economic impact, but also the disparity between the public defense system and the prosecutor system as it stands is systemically problematic and causes great strife in communities of color and communities of lower economic strata.
And Wendell and Lisa, I hope you're still on the call. Welcome. I would love you to continue to be a panelist here and give some additional perspective. You've given great context already. I wanted to give you both the opportunity to respond to what David's saying, especially the public defense and the prosecutor piece of this and some of the barriers that you've seen there. And Wendell, specifically for you, because your experience is both state level but also federal level, how maybe some of our municipal courts, our public defense systems differ from other states or other large cities?
Well, you know, that's a really good question. And to go back to the data, it's hard to distinguish what we're doing here in Nevada as opposed to other communities, other states, because we don't have the data and it's inconsistent and incomplete. Now, what we do have is we have research and testimony from individuals such as Lisa, who are the boots on the ground and can provide information about what's going on in our state from a broader perspective, where we don't have specific demographic data and tracking. And one thing that David mentioned, and Lisa as well, is about funding and funding sources. Well, the first and only time in Nevada where the judicial branch produced a report regarding funding and sources and operations was in 2003. And at that time, 71% of the collected fines and 100% of state mandated administrative assessments funded the municipal courts. Also, with state mandated administrative assessment fees, they're used to pay for special projects such as upgrading case management systems and operating specialty courts. So in Las Vegas, the administrative assessment fees were used to pay for the construction of the Regional Justice Center and its maintenance until 2045. So I hope that helps with some perspective.
And Lisa, if you're still on the call, I'd like you to comment as well.
I am still on the call. And here's one of the things that I will say as it relates to public defenders in this issue of traffic fines and fees. We've all been socialized to believe that if we can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed for us. We hear it on TV when folks are being Mirandized. But what may not largely be known is that there is a fee that is passed on to the defendant when they are assigned a public defender. And that just adds to the layer of of fees that someone in the system is already paying. Now, not necessarily in traffic, because I don't know that we get public defenders for traffic violations and things like that. That's the system David can probably speak much better to than I can. However, in the criminal justice system, period, because some of these fines are also for other issues outside of traffic violations. When someone is appointed a public defender, there is a fee that goes along with that. And I think that is an atrocity. I mean, when you're talking about someone who has to have a public defender, if you're asking for a public defender being assigned one, it should be clear that you are not able to pay for that. And so the system isn't even set up to provide the defense that it says you should be able to have, you should have access to. You are passed on a fine for that. So that's one more fine that people who are in the criminal justice system get. And David can probably speak to that a lot better than I can.
Right. Yeah, and let me just clarify that. So what she said is accurate, that some years ago, a fee was instituted for some indigent defendants to pay or have to theoretically pay back some, not always nominal fee into the system for their public defense. However, it is clear and constitutional, and we haven't pulled this one back yet, but if a person absolutely cannot afford that fee, they cannot be denied counsel. So it is a little bit of a balance, and oftentimes it is just a matter of the fee being imposed after the fact, and it is rarely collected for individuals who cannot afford it, although sometimes it does become problematic. So I don't want to diminish anything that Lisa said, because it's true. It does exist in the system, but it is not as big a barrier as some of these other things, but it is problematic for sure. And when it comes to traffic tickets, you don't have a right to public defense at the onset, but if it does turn into a bench warrant, and if the prosecutors are seeking any degree of continued jail time on you, then again, the Constitution kicks in, it's Gideon, and you're entitled to have competent counsel to guide you through the process. But more importantly, as you go through the process, and whether it is these fines and fees that, look, even in this last legislative session, there was an effort led by Assemblyman Yeager to decriminalize altogether these traffic tickets, to essentially take the teeth out of these improperly imposed bench warrants, which give a license to law enforcement to incarcerate people and disrupt their lives for the most minor of offenses that have now grown into large financial debt to essentially the municipalities. And that failed because of the very reasons that we're talking about, that the municipal courts and the cities, the municipalities, lobbied extraordinarily hard that we cannot lose this revenue stream, that all the good things that they do will be negatively impacted, and that the whole system will become crashing down if we try to, and this was the hyperbole, if we try to limit the fine, fee, and warrant system for the enforcement of even the most modest of otherwise innocuous traffic offenses and disruptions. So that's part of it. But also, you know, I would like to move to the idea of bail and probation, because as the public defense system, you know, you're also arguing for your indigent clients what would be an appropriate measure to secure their release before they're convicted of any offense. And then even if someone is convicted of an offense and they're not incarcerated in prison, they are given an opportunity for probation, which has so many financial implications and terms of required compliance that, you know, not only is that the number one feeder of the failure of compliance on probation into the prison system, but the public defense system really isn't equipped to as adequately deal with these economic issues and disparity issues of probation revocations as they might be with fighting the case or cross-examining witnesses or all the other good things that the very, very talented public defense system does, because it's a little outside of their box, because it really is a social and economic aspect to it, and it is not adequately addressed in our system. And so you find people staying and lingering in jail because they're poor, and you find them going into prison after a probation revocation because of economic factors, which also have a racial component to them. And when we talk about lack of data, we really need to also look at sentencing disparities, how people of color and people of economic distress are being sentenced compared to people who aren't. And then that follows through with who's being revoked for probation, for what reasons and why. And then finally, the data of the length of sentences and the secondary impact upon release on that person and their families. Because even if we talk about, you know, recidivism and the rates of recidivism and the race of individuals who are engaged in recidivism conduct, and recidivism just means repeat, coming out of the system and then coming back into the system. There's no one who's looking at the data to connect the dots as to why the disparities continue to exist. But I think a lot of us intuitively know that it has to do with the very issues that we're talking about today.
And if
I mean, Dave, Wendell, go ahead, please.
And if I might add to what David said, the Nevada Supreme Court in Gilbert v. Nevada indicated that an individual should be given an opportunity to explain his or her inability to pay before being jailed. However, some judges across the state may still not allow individuals to explain their financial circumstances and are continuing to sentence people to jail for failure to pay. In addition, Nevada law doesn't provide a grace period for individuals on payment plans. So if you have an individual who is late on a fine or fee payment, they can still be arrested even if their past payments were on time. So when we talk about generating revenue, there's another example. Yes,
and Wendell, that's true too for the probation system. Certainly in the last legislative session, there was some success in the assembly, and it was signed into law to sort of modify on the probation side some of the technicality revocations. In other words, for non-payment or late payment of probation fees, because I would also be remiss to not say, just as that sometimes they have to pay for their public defenders, they have to pay for their own probation as well. And those probation fees, or the lack of paying them, could very well, at least in the past, and we're going to see how the new law that just took effect on July 1 impacts the system, but they could theoretically be revoked for non-payment of probation fees or related things like having stable housing, like having a job, or, without considering the transportation to that job. And when I said that the public defender system is not as good as advocacy in that realm as they would be possibly in the other areas, and I think it's because these are societal concerns. These are economic factors that may be lost on many attorneys. And I would say that I'd be as guilty as anyone else that, it's hard to translate some of the concepts that we're talking about into the legal terms that sway a judge, especially a judge who may be, have an implicit bias against your client as well. So if you're up there and you're saying, look, judge, don't put my client back into prison, allow them to stay on probation because they missed that appointment, or because they didn't pay their fees, or because they don't have stable housing, to also say, because judge, you have to look at the bigger picture. Statistically, people who live in my client's neighborhood can't manage these type of barriers and concerns. Typically, someone in my client's position with generational poverty isn't going to be able to turn it around on a dime because of the threat of incarceration. And indeed, incarceration will make things worse for him and for society. And so, that's a hard argument for a lawyer to make, unless you have, on your left an economist and on your right a poet, because it is hard to get through to the judges who are just seeing, are you compliant or non-compliant? And that type of statistic really is lost, and the data gathering is insufficient for reaching a solve that is based on the science and based on the economics of what we're talking about, let alone the racial components of it.
Well said, David, and ties so eloquently into our first discussion when we talked about broad-based wealth gaps, and something that came up on the question was asked, big policy changes, what do we need? And first and foremost was looking through everything we do with a racial and equity lens. And I think this is extremely important when we're talking about maybe the education of judges and prosecutors, even public defenders and probation officers as well. As you said, to understand the social implications as much as anything else. I want to come back to that in just a sec. I want to transition into, let's talk and take a deeper dive into the solutions. We've kind of been talking about that already. I want to stop though, and Tracy, I want to see if there are any questions that we have in the queue. Anybody that's raised their hand first before we move on.
No, not right at the moment. Thank you for asking.
So since I was talking about education, let's bring it back to just personal education here, and the resources that are available. If you find yourself in a situation you are not informed of where you are in public defense or probation, David, what resources are available for you to educate yourself, or be able to reach out maybe to community-based organization that can give you recommendations, can give you some advice, some consultation?
That's a bigger question than I think you even realize, Kip. I want to have Wendell respond to that, and then I might jump on some of his thoughts on it, because this is a wide problem. I mean, there are no, look, we as a society look at those who are arrested and those who certainly are prosecuted for offenses as not worthy or loathsome or any host of negative connotations. We see it in our newspapers when mugshots are presented. We see it even in, just to bring it to the relevant protests that we have right now, we see it in the criticism of press releases when people of color die at the hands of police officers, that the very first part of any press conference in Las Vegas specifically is to talk about the criminal history of the individual who died at the hands of police, right? And so it's the vilification of anyone in the system that is the starting point. And unless we get past that, unless we start looking at the individuals instead of the crime, unless we look at the system surrounding the individual and try to figure out how they got to that point and how we can best effectuate what is a true measure of justice versus a facsimile of justice through the lens of vengeance, we're never going to educate anyone. Prosecutors going to prosecute, and defense attorneys are going to to scream at the sky, and individuals are going to be impacted and their families are going to be devastated, and the cycle is going to continue. This is where we have found ourselves in 2020. So if you are an individual accused, you are heavily reliant upon either your private or your public defender to explain the system potentially to your family, and to help everyone get through until they move on to the next in the public defense system of the hundreds of cases that you have.
I concur. The other thing that I think is beneficial would be mandatory training of all judges, court staff, and law enforcement, prosecutors, and public defenders on the use of the bench card. Because from our research, it seems that that's being used inconsistently across the state. So there are those individuals that end up in jail where in another part of the state, they may not end up in jail because of inconsistencies with the bench card.
And just to continue with that, I mean, there are, in progressive areas around the country, there are reforms and new programs and new perspectives that are taking hold. You know, to have this discussion without talking about prosecutorial limitation and prosecutorial reform is foolhardy. In Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia specifically, and also in San Francisco, they have started to do redacted reviews of files to determine whether or not they should be prosecuted or not. In other words, the name of the person, the race of the person, and the address of the person are removed from the documents in screening to determine whether or not the case should proceed and how the case should proceed. They have found statistically that fewer people of color are charged when the prosecutors who are evaluating the merits of the offense don't know the race or the neighborhood of the individual. That's an immediate reform. We have an issue with jury pools in our communities, where they're being found. We also have an extraordinary problem in our state, as the Nevada Supreme Court repeatedly points out, as to removing people of color from juries. I mean, the spectrum of things that we can do right now is far and wide. And I think that when you looked at the initial legislation that was proposed or suggested last Nevada legislative session to address some of these issues, and how so many of them fell by the wayside because there either wasn't enough support or there was fear that the legislators were going to appear to be indifferent to the safety of the community, it's a lost cause. And so I couldn't emphasize enough what Wendell's saying. That education is vital. That training is vital. But there also needs to be consequences to law enforcement, but specifically prosecutors who act in ways that are contrary to the basic precepts that training like that would require.
And David, so much of what you're talking about also is just a lack or loss of data as well. Let's talk about that policy-wise. I mean, is this something that could be enacted at a state legislative level? Are there municipal changes we can make? I mean, when we're talking about data, and maybe we just focus on the fines and fees aspect of this. So I apologize for my broad questions. So I'll try to narrow it down a little bit. But I mean, what can we enact so that we do have more robust and defined data?
You know, that's a great question. So the data management systems that we currently have are outdated, and they don't have the fields to appropriately capture all the demographic data that would be necessary in order for us to have good, strong information for making recommendations. So there's going to have to be a determination of where funding is going to come from to update these systems. And at this point, it's questionable where the funding would come from. As I mentioned, the only time that the judiciary has done a report on where their funding has come from was in 2003. So aside from that, the revenue for improvements is generated from fines and fees.
And is that state level? Is that municipal level for the funding?
And that's a great question. That would be at the state level.
David, comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's true. But I mean, we can garner declarative statements like the likelihood that a person of color would remain in a jail over a person who is not, or of even the likelihood of arrest. We can call lots of different sources. We can call the jails, but a lot of the data is hard to achieve. And I don't know that we have the analysts in place, or if the analysts in place are properly incentivized to review this data. I mean, I certainly could sit in a room with Wendell and other colleagues, and we could come up with literally hundreds of thousands of data points, literally, to really evaluate a picture from a scientific analysis perspective of what's happening, and then try to reverse engineer ways to stop that from happening. But it is not something that has been prioritized in the state of Nevada, as Wendell is indicating. It is not something that there seems to be an immediacy for. The special session did call for more data, but that's where it ended. And so what happens with that data, with that compliance, with even audits of that data are unknown. And so, yeah, if we lived in a system that prioritize that sort of data culling and analysis and action, we might be able to solve some of the issues that we're talking about here today. Do we give up on the data that we do have? Absolutely not. But, you know, especially as it relates to the direct financial responsibilities of those in the criminal justice system, we at some point have to say, we are going to get a different revenue stream. We are going to look for different ways to fund what we determine to be important programming and or buildings and or maintenance and or the data analysis itself. And if that means property taxes, if that means seeking different revenue sources from public or private entities or grants, that needs to be the priority, because right now we're working in a system that is hurting people. We're working in a system right now that is hurting families, and I would argue that is hurting our community and the ability to derail what is commonly understood in Nevada especially as a problematic, if not devastating, school to prison pipeline. And it's all part of that pipeline, and everything we're talking about is a segment, but most of it can be traced back to issues that individuals had as children and their interactions with the systems that we're talking about as well. So as I think you implied earlier, Kip, it's not just one system. They're all interconnected. They're all interrelated. They all need to be discussed in this context of what we do with our criminal justice system.
And you know, David, I concur with that. Those were part of the recommendations that we had in 2017 for alternative funding streams for the courts, and to develop clear standards for court administrators and judges to determine a person's ability to pay. Also, more reporting. And it's interesting that you mentioned that the last special session, they talked about more data, but we're not collecting data. And then with the case management systems that we currently have, they don't have the capability for us to use this data for analysis. So it's sort of a vicious circle.
And that was certainly one of the and this is the special session that just happened, right? This was the one that just concluded today. That was discussed by some legislators, like and even public commentators during the public comment period. Do we know the right fields? Do we have the processing tools? What are we going to do with this data? And there was no answer.
This is Lisa. I have a couple things, you know, and talking about how do we begin to end the system, this unjust system of fines and fees in the criminal justice system, whether it's traffic violations or probation fees or fees to have an electronic monitor or something like that. I think it's simpler than we think. Just stop assessing these fees. When I think about other cities who are doing it, San Francisco has eliminated their assessment. They've eliminated. They just don't add it in for certain cases. We're asking our legislature, do you know what? To just stop suspending people's driver's license. And we're asking our legislature to stop issuing warrants for traffic violations. This will eliminate a lot of the fees that we're talking about, because when somebody has a traffic warrant, and there are fees that go with that warrant. If you want to pay it, you got to get on a payment plan for most people. There's a fee associated with a payment plan. There's an additional assessment that comes with the payment plan. In some cases, I think there are even fees to perform community service. So we're asking a legislature, you know what, just stop doing that. Other states, we have so many models that I am finding in this position as the state director for fines and fees, where I'm finding that other states are doing exactly what we're asking them to do. But one of the things that we are doing is seeking alternative funding measures, because of course, as we have all said, that's the court's card, right? They're saying, well, we need to fund these courts. We need to do this. But we're also looking at a budget analysis, like where is our money that's coming from this system going? One of the things I found out a couple days ago is I believe it's 50%. I'm not sure what the percentage of the administrative assessments that come from court are mandated by the Constitution that they have to go to education. They go to education. Now, we know that the education funding formula is a train wreck, but much of these fees are mandated to go certain places. And so courts are coming up with crafty other ways to fund their courts within the fines and fees system. So we're just asking the legislatures to say, you know what, just take that power away. Just take that power away. And we believe that there are some legislators who are on board with that. We'll see. Our chairman, Mr. Yeager, we've talked with him, and we're currently just finding out from our legislators what is the appetite. The courts are going to fight. They've been fighting, but it's time. It really is time. And I think all of us that are on this call have some power in this. We can put pressure on our legislators to say, look, we just have to do this. And here are some models from around the country where other states are doing it, and they're finding other ways to fund these courts that you all say is so imperative that you get this money to form. It's hurting families, it's hurting communities, it's hurting us as a state. When an officer has to take time out of their day to arrest someone for a traffic warrant, for a ticket, for an expired registration, what's the fiscal impact of that? Because now this officer is taking time away from enforcing more serious crime to arrest somebody on a traffic violation. So we are also analyzing that and presenting that data. And I think we're going to come up with a pretty viable argument for why we should simply just stop assessing these fees.
And a lot
David,
of those arguments
go,
have been made. Yeah, a lot of those same arguments are being made in removing bail, a cash bail. And it is very important. And I think that, the counter to all these arguments is always community safety. But Lisa makes a fantastic point, is that by tying up law enforcement to do a lot of these menial things or enforcement of menial offenses is taking them away from community safety. And that's an excellent point. And, the same thing with bail, once and I believe Justice Hardesty was really the champion of it from our Nevada Supreme Court, of suggesting that there is evidence-based analysis that has operated in other states that, there's good reason to not require poor people to remain in custody on a cash bail. And that doesn't mean that the community is going to be less safe, especially on something like a bench warrant for a traffic offense. And so, it's all part of the same kind of mindset in the system. And what we're always fighting is political will. And that's what killed it in the 2019 session, even though it was proposed. Both bail reform was proposed and the decriminalization of traffic offenses and warrants was all put out there, and there just wasn't the political will at the time to move forward with it because, again, even our Democratic leadership was saying, look, we cannot put the community at risk without talking about the bigger picture of how risky all of this system is to the entirety of the community.
Yet I think that we are absolutely putting our communities at risk when officers, again, are tied up enforcing traffic violations and warrants for those things and not out there fighting more serious crime. I absolutely think that's an issue.
David, can you speak to specialty courts and diversion courts in this, their role as a potential solution as well? Yeah, can you provide some context there?
Yeah, just really briefly. So the advent of specialty courts over the last decade or so is really a measure of trying to address some of the societal issues. So in other words, a different pathway to incarceration would be to go to one of these diversion or specialty courts to receive treatment, to have a team approach to protecting the individual and guiding them through the system with a little bit more of a support in place. And in theory, that's wonderful, right? That's a way to keep people out of prison, to keep them in the community. Those programs typically encourage and also assist and help people finding appropriate housing, appropriate jobs, mental health treatment, drug and alcohol treatment, gambling treatment, all these, and for unique groups like veterans, these are all designed to keep people out of the prison system and to empower them to not become recidivists. So all that is really, really good. All that is really, really expensive. A lot of these diversion courts, especially the DUI diversion courts, are extraordinarily expensive for individuals to participate in. And they don't always take into account some of the other factors which are barriers. And you can fail the diversion courts, which puts you right back into the pipeline for incarceration. And some of the critiques of those systems are that maybe they are not as in tune or aware of some of the systemic racial or economic factors that cause people to fail even from the diversion courts. The diversion courts aren't free. And again, some of these fines and fees that we talked about are responsible for the funding necessary to have bigger, better, and more comprehensive diversion programs. So while, in theory, they're a really good way to start to think about alternatives to incarceration and depopulation of a broken prison system, and I absolutely endorse the expansion of diversion courts, it is part of the conversation of how do we afford it, how do we fund it, both in money and time resource, because to be done correctly, it really needs to take into account every individual and not treat them the way that the criminal justice system does in mass. Unfortunately, the one major criticism beyond the economic of the diversion courts is that it is still operated through the lens of a criminal justice system that really emphasizes the stick of punishment over the more ethereal goal of rehabilitation and empowerment.
We have just a few minutes left. I want to transition the conversation to resources here as another piece of the solution here as well. And since we're talking about fees and fines primarily, we've been talking about traffic tickets as these entry-level pieces to the criminal justice system. Maybe we talk about that specifically. What resources do we have available here? If you are in this situation, who can you potentially reach out to, being that we do have a lot of service providers on the call today?
Well, I mean, service providers are really important. The individuals who are on the ground dealing with folks in mental health, addictive services, empowerment services, people who guide people through financial difficulties, social workers. I mean, this is all part of the broader teams that really should start replacing or augmenting the criminal justice system. Someone in the comments wrote the words restorative justice. That's a new movement as well. That's an effort to try to holistically make bad situations better. That's a very broad way of looking at what restorative justice is. But that to me is really the alternative to this incarceration paradigm that we're facing. And so, you know, if people are less hesitant to call the cops, but really try to work things out, things like alternative dispute resolution, mediation, the burgeoning restorative justice processes, these are all very important aspects that need to be brought into the conversation. Wendell?
Wendell, Lisa, would you like to respond with any additional resources that are available?
I'd like to say I'm hoping that we can develop some of those resources. I know there are community organizations that are working with folks. There are bail funds. There are funds to help people bail out of jail or to pay some of these fines and fees that they may have. So those organizations do exist. There's the Mass Liberation Project. I'm sorry, did you guys hear me at all? I think I was muted. I was just saying that.
I think we lost Lisa.
Right.
Lisa, we heard you and then you just dropped off, but I think you're back.
No, she's talking.
Now I think she muted herself. Let's see.
But so Lisa was talking about Restorative Justice Project through Plan of Southern Nevada. They have been very instrumental in getting people with the lowest, most ridiculously small bails out of the custodial situation. People who have bails less than $500. They have a Twitter account that tells us how many people are in custody for outrageously low bails that they can't even meet for no purpose that serves society. So, you know, they are out there. The Mass Liberation Project is doing very important work on this topic.
You know, there's another resource as well, and it's the grant program within the Department of Justice through the Bureau of Justice Assistance, where they provide funds for leadership and assistance to local criminal justice programs to improve and reinforce the criminal justice system. So that may also be a resource for the state going forward.
And then also with some of the housing and other issues, there's all sorts of mediation and programs that have been administered through the courts for individuals, and additionally legal aid has definitely, and Nevada Legal Services are also very good at the idea of creating greater access to justice, maybe not explicitly in the criminal justice realm, but some of the ancillary concerns that individuals who are in the criminal justice realm could benefit from. And certainly they're a valuable resource in our community as well.
And if I'm hearing you all correctly, no matter the level of fine and fee here, even if we're talking about potential traffic tickets, it's good to reach out to these resources and get proper advice early on from Legal Aid Center and other resources. I think we're just about out of time. Tracy, I wanted to go to you one more time just to see if we have any questions that are in the queue.
I don't see any, and I see no raised hands. Thank you for asking. Oh, wait, hold on one second. Lori Martin would like to say a really quick word about Bridges Out of Poverty training. Really quick. Let's go ahead and unmute Lori. Lori, are you there?
Good, yes, thank you. I'm a Bridges Out of Poverty trainer with Opportunity Alliance Nevada, and we have done trainings in the past with our justice system here in Washoe County, and something as simple as changing the way they do their appointments for people coming in so they don't get penalized because they didn't show up Monday between 9 and 11, but they were able to come in the time of a week span, for example, made a huge difference in how people ended up in the pipeline. So through a training and sort of raising consciousness and looking at the systems change from simple, inexpensive ways of doing business can have a huge impact.
And that was the only comment we had, Kip. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. And Wendell, David, and Lisa, thank you for joining the conversation. We thank you all. A great conversation. I can't believe how much we covered. actually in an hour and 20 minutes. We ran the gamut. Of course, there's a lot more of a deeper dive to take in each one of these issues. We briefly mentioned the school to prison pipeline, and of course, and that is not only probably one forum, but multiple forums in itself. We thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it. And Linda, I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you, Kip. And I really just want to echo your sentiments. Thank you, panelists, Wendell, David, Lisa. Educational, enlightening. I think this conversation could have gone on for quite some time, and maybe we discuss future conversations. A lot of poignant things that came to mind. David, you mentioned the system right now is hurting families and hurting our community, and that's not what anybody wants. And we need to look at it very much from the financial component and the burden that it puts on them. As we mentioned, these panel series are recorded, so you can find them on our website at a later date. And our next series will be next Thursday around education. And I'm not going to take up any extra time. I want to thank you all for being here today. We appreciate your participation. We look forward to you coming and joining us next week. And please stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.